Remember when I told you guys about logo turtle? So you can go you can give it a command and it'll do what you want it to do right away. Same with terminal, I can just interact with it right away. As I'm typing, it gives me the results just as I'm typing. See, that's what I really like about JavaScript is that it works just like those other ones where I just type and it can change things right away. See, that's why it's an interpreted language. That's why they're so cool. So initially I thought I'd create a bunch of videos to put in a series to explain how to code, but then it kind of dawned on me that might just be, a little bit too much. Might as well just have one big honking video that shows the majority of things, and then we can take it from there. So before I begin on the super technical stuff, let me just talk about an overview of how I code in general and how I code JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. And you'll notice first thing is that I don't really use IDE. Okay, I generally use one of these web editors. Okay, Ace Editor is a very popular one. That's what I'm using right now. And you can see a video of mine. It's called HTML Editor. It's currently my most popular video. It'll show you how to set this up, where we can see the results right away as we type. See? So that's kind of what I'm going for is I want to see things right away, just like logo and terminal. I just want to see things as I type them. It's really important for UI. Now, the way I see HTML, or the way I see everything really, is that I just want to give it as little amount of types as I can. Little amount of syntax, that is. So in HTML, if you ever read an HTML book, they'll give you hundreds of tags to choose from. But I say no, let's just keep it typeless. I just want div for the most part. Sometimes I'll use image or table or some other things like video but for the most part, this is the main element, and this is what the majority of my video will be about, just how to style a div. Okay, and trust me, when you get good at this, you can create anything you want, any program in the world. As mentioned, the HTML portion of my coding is just super simple. It's just divs. So we've covered HTML, done. Now, as far as CSS goes, I don't know if you've seen this before. I'm gonna assume that you haven't seen any of this code before, but basically there's two ways that we can style a div. Okay, we can either set it up as a class or we can set it up with its own ID. Class is important when you want to style multiple things. So let's say, I don't know, let's just say that they all share the same look of square. Okay. Now the reason why you're not seeing it yet is because I haven't styled it. And usually you just put everything inside the style tag within the head. So in order to target these three, or however many ones that use this class square, I'll just use the dot syntax. So dot square, and then here I'll define the look. Basically, let's say that this one was called square one. So see how it's ID. So the way we target IDs is with the pound sign. So square one, and then I'd give it a look here. Now, so those are the two main ways or the two main things that I target with CSS. Okay, just classes and IDs. Now, why do we need both? Okay, right now, let's say the square. Let's just give it a look for all three of them. So we'll give it like a background red, a width, and a height. And you'll see we'll have three squares. And I'll give it a margin for the bottom so you'll see them. So these are the three squares that I'm talking about. And the reason why we like to use classes in CSS is because we can target multiple elements, see? So it'll target all three of these elements. Now, IDs are mainly like a coding thing. They're mainly used in JavaScript. Okay, I mean, even though we can still style it, for example, let's say I gave it a background green. I mean, we can still style it in CSS and stuff like that. But mainly the reason why we have an ID is because we want a unique identifier for each one of these squares. Okay, so let's say I'd have like square 2, whatever. Just I just need a way to target this one element with code, and I'll get into the code in a little while. But yeah, for the most part in CSS, we just have these elements. Another one that I use quite a lot is hover. So, you know, let's say I wanted to make this blue when I hover over it. Oops, this one doesn't work. I'm gonna have to go important on it. Anyway, we'll get into the nitty-gritty later on, but just note that hover is a pretty important one as far as, like, you know, when I want to hover over stuff, just to, you know, change the color. But for the most part, forget about hover for now. We're just gonna focus on these two different types of CSS selectors. So one is with classes. Those are ones that begin with a dot, you know, all the things that we declare as class here, and IDs that we want to target them individually. So like, let's say I didn't even use a class here for square 1. I could, you know, just take this stuff and plop it here, and I'll have another, you know, I'll have a different looking square. But you'll see how I go about this as I continue this video. But the majority of the things that I'll talk about in this video, well, really it's not just this video. I mean, it's always like this. The main thing that I work on are these properties. So I have like 20 or 30 CSS properties that I know, that I frequently see again and again and again. And those are the ones that I'm going to explain in this video are the ones that I use all the time, not just, you know, this isn't something like random or anything like that. I use this every single day almost. So as mentioned, you know, HTML is pretty straightforward. I'm just using divs, and CSS is pretty straightforward because I'm just using like 2 selectors for the main part, like for the most part, I mean, either a dot to select classes or a pound to select IDs. Don't worry about anything else, maybe a hover, like colon hover, but that's about it. The majority of this video will be centered around the different types of properties in CSS. There's like 20 or 30 of them, but the nice thing about it is because I'm just using one element, you know, just the div, that once you understand those properties, you can create anything you want. Now, I just want to do a quick overview of how JavaScript plays into all this. So, you know, I'll have a script tag inside the body, and this is where I write my code. And JavaScript, for the most part, it's very simple. I mean, it's the main way code runs is with functions. So let's say I had like a function here called hello. And the main way that this thing gets called is with events. Okay, so the most popular being the onclick event, for example. If I click this box, this first one, then it'll call this function. Let's alert hi for now. See? So functions generally functions are just like a way to just separate our code. You know, maybe we'll have like a bunch of different lines of code here. And the functions themselves get called on an event, such as a click event. Sometimes they get called with a programmatic type of event, like an onload event will start off my program. Like this will be the first function that gets called in my program. Okay, and then maybe this function calls other functions and so forth. But they mainly get initiated with events. Now, if you think about it, all we're doing in JavaScript is we're just changing the look of this program essentially. Like we're changing CSS properties. You know, maybe I'll click on this and this one turns green, or this one animates to the right, or presents information. So either we change CSS properties or we just change the content of HTML. Like for example, I mean, I could let's say I'll click on this box and all of a sudden I'll have some text in this box or something, basically the ability to change HTML on the fly. Let me give you an example. Like, let's say I had a container here, and I'll put those 3 boxes inside that container. Now let's say I wanted to do this thing programmatically. So in the init function, I could have had var element is equal to document get element by ID, and then container, and then lm.innerHTML is equal to this, right? And that would be equivalent to what I had before. And by the way, because I'm dealing with an iframe here, every time I make a change, it reloads the page. So that's why you saw the init getting called. But, just like I had it before inside the container, I could have done it programmatically. There's no difference. With JavaScript, all we have to do is just target this inner HTML of an element, and we can write our own HTML here. It's no problem. So by the way, why do we want to have the ability to create HTML in code? Well, it's because programs are not, think about if you design like a program, it's just static, right? You can't really interact with it. We need a way, like think about a checkout for some kind of supermarket thing that you buy some food. Let's say we're interacting with a UI there. So we're clicking on buttons, it's presenting us with some data. It's all interactive and it's all moving. So again, in order to do that, all I'm doing is just changing either CSS properties or changing HTML. And that's about it. Anyway, I wanted to talk about the most important element in the world when it comes to UI, and that is the box, the div. That's what it's called in HTML. Okay, this is the #1 element. Okay, forget about everything. Just if you're a coder, if you've been doing this for a while, forget about everything they told you. Forget about all the components and all the hundreds of different components. I mean, a lot of the times, like, beginners will go into HTML and they'll see like so many different components like Lee and UL and HR and BR and just like a million different types of not necessarily components, but just syntax in HTML. Okay, I want to get rid of all of that. I just want div for the most part. Okay, for like the vast majority of things, we'll just have div. And a lot of the times, if you use frameworks, they will not only encourage you to use components, but encourage you to create components. And that's also a big waste of time. Well, sometimes you do want to create a component, but I'm going to show you how to do that just with boxes, because boxes rule. And the more syntax you create, okay, the more different types of things, like let's say I'll have like 100 different types here, not just div, then that's exactly what makes coding hard. I used to do that for many, many years, and it made my programming like 10 times slower. So now I don't even deal with that stuff anymore. I am fully typeless. So what I'm trying to do is essentially reduce the number of types and the number of syntax within this body tags. Okay, this is where we're going to write most of the code. But trust me, I mean, you might not agree with me right now, or you might not 100% believe me, but the more types or the more different types of syntax you have here, the harder your programming will get. Okay, I mean, it's not that bad when it's just a few things, but when you get to like the hundreds and hundreds of things, and they're all different, they all act differently, that's when the coding becomes really challenging. So my whole philosophy is just use, for the most part, just one element. And the only thing that we're changing is just the style of this element, or the properties of this element, also called CSS. Okay, so in this video, I'm just going to go over the main properties of this one element. Okay, I'm only going to be dealing with div, but there's a lot of, well, not that many, but there's a few properties, and you know, the more you work on this, I mean, the more you practice this, you'll notice that you'll see the same ones pop up again and again and again, and it'll become so commonplace for you to just create any type of look that you want. Once you understand the fundamental way that CSS works. And one thing that I can help with is just show you which are the most frequently occurring ones, because I've built many things in HTML and CSS. So I can give you that perspective, and then, you know, just focus on the ones that you need. But yeah, let's just talk about the main properties that we use to style one of these boxes. So the first thing that you'll notice is that these are probably the three most important, right? I mean, if I just have a div, right, with nothing in it, with no style, you won't see anything, right? Because now the box is transparent. So even if I have text in there, the box is still transparent. You won't see the actual box that this text is in. So let me just style the box right now so you can see it. First of all, let's give it a background. Let's say it had a background of red. You'll see that by default, divs extend to the width of the container. So right now, it's going to extend to the entire width of the body when I just go background red. If I wanted it to be a little bit smaller, I could just give it a smaller width. So width 200 pixels. By the way, the main units that I'll be using is just pixels, so px, and percentages. Now, one big gotcha that you'll find, or let me also like put a height of 200 so we'll see the box a little bit better. Let me get rid of this text. So another thing that you'll notice a lot of new developers get to when they try to use percentage widths or percentage height, they won't see the result on the screen. It's a pretty common problem. And the reason for this, right, if you just try to do it like this, is that 50% and 50% like this, it tries to get the size from its parent, from body. So the first thing to note is because we didn't give the body and HTML size, it doesn't know what to size itself to, because whenever you give a percentage, okay, in these types of dimensions, it always goes to the parent. So the parent right now it doesn't have a size. So let's just give both parents, the HTML and body, a size. Okay, and we're going to give them 100% and 100%. See, now I see it. See, before when HTML and body didn't have a size, it didn't work because it's like 50% of what? So 50% of this. So generally speaking, when we start our program, we're going to have, you know, width of 100% and height of 100% on HTML and body, and that's just by default. We can do that. Now you'll notice there's also a little bit of margin here where we can also zero out. You know, if I just give it 0, or you can also go 0 pix, same thing. That's what people commonly do when they just start off an application like this. Let's just talk about colors really quickly. You'll notice that I can either put in like a basic color name, like let's say red, yellow, green, blue, whatever, you know, like the basic ones. And, you know, like white. You can also have like transparent. But in any case, let's say I gave it a color, a basic color, but if you want to make it a little bit more customized, you can give it a hex value. So here I'll give it like a gray hex color. Now, one thing you can do if you want more colors, just put in like a hex value. You just do the number sign and then 6 digits, and then it'll give you the color picker. So let's say you want, I don't know, let's say we want a color like this, 933 something. I'll just copy this, okay, and then I'll put it in my program, and there you go. Okay, now I'm just going to quickly go over the properties that have to deal with the box's appearance. I'm just going to go over these very quickly. Don't worry about remembering everything here. This is just an overview. You know, later when we start creating stuff, that's when, you know, your knowledge will solidify. This is mainly just to, you know, just to get an introduction of all the different things that we can change here. You know, as I mentioned before, we have width and height. For the most part, we're just going to deal with pixels. Okay. Another important one is margin. So remember how earlier we had margin on the body itself? We can have margin on the box. Okay, so now it's effectively the same thing because it's the it's the first element here, but margin on this box would be a margin for all the different sides of the box. I could also have just a margin, say, for the left or for the top or for the right or for the bottom. But right now, let's just keep it on all sides. Another thing that we have is padding. Okay, you'll only see padding when you have content in the box. So let's say we had some content in there. And by the way, I'll just make the font size much bigger so we'll be able to see it. Maybe 50 or something. So see how padding, now I have some room, right, from where the text begins. If I didn't have padding, then I wouldn't have that much room. We can also only apply it to the top, right? We can apply it to the left, just like the margin. Or we can apply it to all sides. Now remember earlier how we were talking about the font size? We can change a lot of aspects to the font. Like let's say font weight, you can make it bold. Font family, I could change the type of font like Arial, or let's say Courier, just different types of fonts. The background, remember when I told you we could just have it either like as a hex value or as a basic color? You can also do stuff like linear gradient. Let's say red to blue or something. Oh yeah, let's just keep it as a color for now. Another thing that we have is border, the border of the box. So I can go border, let's say 10 pixels, solid, black. And now this, the first one is the thickness of the border. So we can change it to 20, 30, whatever, or 0 would not even show it. Solid, you can have like different types of, of borders, like dashed, for example. But we'll just keep it solid. And black is just the color. So we can make it green. See how now it's green, blue, whatever. We'll just keep it black. We can also change the border radius. Okay, so if I didn't want just a perfect square, I could make it like a rounded rectangle. So border radius, let's say 20 pixels. See how now it becomes like curved or even more like that. See? Or I can make it, let's say 50% would make it a circle. Color usually concerns the text itself. So let's say I go color white, change the font color. Color red obviously won't show anything because the background is red. Okay, we'll just change it back to color black for now. Let's just talk about alignment for a second. Like if I just had like two little, just two words here. Let's say I wanted to align this to the right. So I'd go text align right. Okay, well, or if I wanted it centered. What if I wanted it vertically centered? There's a little like CSS hack where you can go like line height. If you make it equal to the actual height, then it'll, make it in the middle. Or just change the line height to make it, to just change the size of it vertically. We can also change the shadow of the box. So I can go box shadow, let's say 10 pix, 10 pix, 10 pix. Don't worry about the actual syntax right now. Just know that there's a way to change, if I want like a shadow for this box. Another good thing is that I can have RGBA values. I think it goes from like, yeah, it actually goes to 255. Yeah. So 0 to 255 if you want RGBA. A usually means the opacity of it. Right now it's white, so we won't see it. So let's just make it back to black, and we'll make it 0.5, the opacity of the shadow. Or you could just give it a color like gray, blue, and it'll apply its own opacity to it. I'll just make this gray for now, and let's make it a little bit smaller. And I'll give it good line height. So now let me just go over the properties that deal with the with the behavior of the box. So right now you can see that I can actually select this text. See how like big the selection is? It's because of that line height. But let's say I didn't want to make anybody select it. Okay, I could do user select none, and now you cannot select the text in there. And by the way, there's a lot of different ways to align things. I'm going to go over that a little bit later. So another one that's good to know is, actually let me make the line height regular for now. So let's say I had a bunch of content in here. You'll see that it overflows. See? If I didn't want it to overflow, I just go overflow, hidden, and then anything that overflows outside of the box just won't be shown. Another thing that I can do is overflow scroll. So now I'll have a scroll bar. Let's change the cursor. Okay, let's say I did cursor pointer, and there's a lot of different types of cursors. This is just one example, but see how if I go over it now, the cursor will change. Now you see how this text, before I had a lot of content in there, let's say we just have a little bit of content, I could go, I can make it not wrap. So white space, no wrap. It will, you know, just keep it on the same line. But because we have scroll, we can see it. Another good thing to know is, you know, let's say you had a click event, okay, that would call this function. We're going to go later more into JavaScript, but just for now, let's say I did an onclick to go. In here, I'd have like some script or something. I mean, this is what tells it to use JavaScript. So let's say I had a function go that alerted hello. So if I press this right now, it would alert. See? Hello. Sometimes though, you want to disable any type of event on this box. There's a lot of different types of events. Now, if for example, there's pointer events none, now if I click on it, nothing will happen. It won't call this event anymore on click. Sometimes like you want to disable these things, so it's kind of handy. Let me get rid of the JavaScript stuff for a second. But another super important thing to know is variables in CSS. So a good place to put them is in the beginning, inside the head, inside the style. Just you know, just this is how you define CSS variables. And let's say I'll go like my color, and I don't know, let's just give it some kind of whatever. We'll make it blue. So if I wanted to use this variable called my color, I just take the name, and for some odd reason they wanted to do 2 dashes on the name, but whatever. It's the way they made this. But let's say I wanted to give it, okay, I wanted the background to be this color. So I'd go var my color. And see now the background is taking the variable color. So if I change the variable, you know, it'll change that. Now the cool thing is that when you have variables, like you could have multiple divs. You could have like, let's say, a few divs that would all do this var thing. Well, this thing is getting kind of big, but let's say I had 2 of them, right? Now they both have this variable, and if I change it, they'll both change. See? Variables can also be in terms of like a size, let's say like 50 pixels or something. And so this wouldn't make sense for this anymore, but if it was on the width, right? var my color, even though it's not really a color anymore. My size, I mean, 50 pix. So just note that variables can also be other types like pixel size, not just color. So now I want to talk about probably the most important subject of all, and that is how do we position these divs around the screen? And how do they relate to each other? How can you nest them? Stuff like that. Because that's how all components are made, right? You're just putting divs right next to each other, right? So first of all, an important one to know is display. Okay, by default, I mean, even if I didn't have this written here, it would be just like I wrote display block. Okay, so all divs are display block, even though I give them a width and a height. You see, it looks like it just takes this, but it doesn't. It actually takes up the entire line. So if I were to inspect this, see how I have my my mouse hovering above this element. See how it takes up the entire line? So what that means is that if I were to have another div right after him, then it would take up another line, and so forth. Now, how would we make these side by side? So that would be an inline block. Okay, so just basically the difference between a block and an inline block. It's very, very useful to know. Now there's another display which is just inline, but don't worry about that one too much. It's just the same as inline block, except it doesn't really look at these values of width and height. It just automatically decides how big something should be. Now see how large these two are? It's because they're both essentially using the same exact style. So let me just put this as a class. This is a very common thing to do, but let's just call it my box, and I'm just going to put everything in there. See how I started off with a dot. So dot just means it's going to be a class. I'll now just put class is equal to, and it would be the exact same. This is equivalent to all this. Okay, just by defining this class up here. And remember to put a dot before it. But so let me just do the same thing here. Now again, they're equivalent, but it would be a lot easier because then it wouldn't take so much space. See, so it's the same as before. Now I want to show you, what happens if we put a div inside of a div. So for that, I'm going to make this one div a lot bigger. So let's say 400 by, I don't know, 200. Now notice that this width and height, it overrode this width and height. So a style always overrides a class, and that way you can kind of use the same properties on multiple elements. But anyway, I'm going to put this box inside of this. See, there you go. It's nested. Because text, see when it doesn't have anything in it? When a piece of text is not surrounded by anything, it's considered to be an inline element. So that's why they're next to each other right now. And actually, I'll make this have a different background so you can see it better. Now let's get rid of this test in here, and we're just going to have this this box inside of this box. All right, so now I'm going to go over probably what I consider to be one of the most important properties of CSS, and that is position. Basically, for that, just for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to take away the margin and padding from both boxes. Okay, remember they share this class, myBox, so they both had that. Now, again, if you want to override certain properties or make properties unique to a box, then you can just set the style after you set the class. For now, though, I'm just going to make the parent. And by the way, I'm going to refer to the gray box as the parent and the blue box as the child, because the child is nested within the parent. See how I end the div for the child here, but then I end the parent div here. So let's just give the parent a large margin, like 100. Okay, so this is going to be the white space around the element. Now, by default, all elements in CSS, or the divs, have a position of static by default. Okay, so if I had this line or if I didn't have this line, it would be the same exact thing because everybody has a position of static by default. Now, the thing with static, though, is it doesn't give you access to properties that I need, such as left, top, bottom, and right. Okay? The minute or the moment you put a position other than static, then you'll have access to left, top, bottom, and right. Okay? The two positions we'll look at is position absolute and position relative. Right now, if I set this to be position absolute, now I have the ability to use those other parameters that I told you about, such as left, top, bottom, and right. So let's set the left to 0 and the top to 0. So see how the blue box now, it went outside of the parent and it went right to the edge here. Now let's say left and top were 5. Now it's going to go 5 pixels to the right and 5 pixels to the bottom. Now the thing is, you see that it went relative to the body of the document. Okay, what if we wanted it to be relative to its parent? So the way that happens is that position absolute, it looks up the parent chain. Okay, it goes parent one by one, and it looks to see which parent has position set, either absolute or relative, and that's the one it's going to be relative off of. Okay, so right now, when if I go up the parent chain, you'll see that position is not set. I mean, it's set to static, but it's not set to something other than static in its parent. So it's like, okay, so you don't have that, so I will ignore you, and I'll go up one more parent. Now, body is the last parent. It doesn't really matter if you have position set there or not. The last one it goes to is body, and if all the parents up until body didn't have position, then it'll just set itself relative to the body. Now, if I did have a position set on the parent, like for example, I'll go position relative. Now, the blue box is relative to the gray box. So if I went, left 25 pixels, see how it's relative to the gray box? And so forth. So position absolute is a way to get access to these important elements, left, top, bottom, and right. So if I went bottom 0 pixels and right 0 pixels, you see it went to the corner. And if I did top and left, it'll go to the other corner. Okay. If, let's say I wanted it to be down here, then I would just go bottom. See, and that's how you use these properties. They're very important for positioning. But again, I only have access to these properties as soon as I set the position to either absolute or relative. So let me just put it back to what it was. Position absolute and position relative. Now you see how I used position absolute? I could also do position relative. Now the difference between these two is that position relative is always going to be relative to itself, to where it would have been in the document flow. So right now, if I make position relative and then I go top or left 50, it'll be relative to where it would have been. Okay, so without anything, okay, it would have been here. So when we go position relative and I change these coordinates, then it's going to be relative to where it was, relative to itself. You see that? Another thing is position relative is a little bit is trickier than position absolute because it actually takes space in the document flow. And what I mean by that is, here, let me just go position relative on both. I'm going to make another box. Let's make a red box. Now, because these two boxes are inline-block, okay, they're going to be side by side. But now you'll notice that the red box went to the right of the blue box. And that is because the blue box is taking space in the document flow. Okay? If they were both set to absolute, then they wouldn't take that space. Absolute is essentially like a way to make things hover. Okay, so see how now they're both absolute and now they're not next to each other? It's because absolute doesn't really care about document flow. It's just going to put itself to where you wanted it to be. So let's say the red one, I wanted it to be like 30 pixels and 30 pixels. So you can essentially like put them anywhere you want with absolute. And relative, very similar, although it does take space in the document flow. So these will become a lot more clear as I make components. Again, position, relative, and absolute are so important that I use them almost every day, I'd say. So it's when I build more things, then you'll understand more about how these work. Last position I wanted to talk about is just position fixed. It's just like position absolute that goes relative to the body. So if I went position fixed, you'll see the blue one went relative to the body. Another way to say this is relative to the browser window. Because this is an iframe that I'm using right here, the browser window essentially starts from here, not from here. One other thing that I forgot to mention about position absolute, you see, because they don't really take up any space in the document, you just position them with coordinates, right? Just like a drawing program. See how the red is above the blue? You can change the Z index on things. So for example, let's say I wanted the blue to be above the red. If I set the Z index to 1, then you'll see the blue index above the red. Now let's say I set the Z index on the red to be 2. Now the red's going to be above. Let's set it to 3. Blue is going to be above, and so forth. Whatever gets the highest index is the one that's going to be on top of the other elements. Now, one thing that's important to mention about display inline block, okay, when you have things that are side by side to each other, and right now I just gave them all a different height, just so you can see this better. But again, the way I override the height is if I just give a style after I set a class. So the height was set in the class, but then I overrode this height with a new value. This is just like on a different line, so it might not look a little bit. But in any case, see, now we have different heights here. One important thing to remember about inline block is that you can vertical align them. It's very important because now I can vertically align them to the top. And this is for the common line that they're under. If I did vertical align bottom, see how it aligns it here? I'll do top again just so you can see it. See how it aligns it here? And then I'll do middle, and it aligns it to the middle. So it's just an important thing to note, especially if you're dealing with inline block, is that you can align them. Now I just wanted to show you something that's very similar to inline block. Let's get rid of this inline block for now because we just have a blue box inside of a gray box. Now by default, if I put in some text, okay, let's say this is the blue box right here, okay? If I put in some text, some random text, you'll see how it goes right after the box. Now, I could make this thing display inline block, right? And then it would go a little bit to the side of it as much as it can. But another way to do this is to float the box left. Okay, it'll do a slightly better job of like wrapping the text around an element. You can almost think about this as a newspaper kind of look. But yeah, you could either float to the right or float to the left. But most of the time, we just use display inline block. Float is kind of getting old. I mean, but it's still useful at times. Now, remember what I said, by default, these divs have display block. Okay, that's the default value. And again, you could set it as inline block if you want them side by side. Another really important use for display is just to set display none. Okay, then it just won't even show it. And you can set display none to any element that you don't want to show. Now, one thing I wanted to note, if you do have a div that's position set to absolute, at this point I can use left, right, and so forth, or left and top. If you wanted it to be in the middle of the screen, a neat, easy trick is to use calc. So you go calc, let's go 50% minus half of the width is 100 pixels. And I'll go calc 50% minus half of the height, which is 40. So now it's going to be vertically and horizontally centered. And I'll let you work out the math there, but basically this 50% refers to its parent. Okay, the size of its, the width of its parent. Or, excuse me, when I'm talking about top, it's going to be the height of its parent, and when I'm talking about left, it's going to be the width of its parent. So right now, 50% refers to 50% of this guy's width. And 50% here would refer to 50% of this guy's height, of the body's height. So basically what you see in white here. So another very important topic is animation. And the way we achieve that is two ways. First one, the easier one, and probably the one that's most often used, is transition. So for the transition property, you tell it what properties you want to animate. And we're just going to select all for now and give it 2 seconds. What that means is that any property that we change right now, let's say like a width or a height or background or opacity or whatever you want to change, it will animate through it. Like it'll morph between the two values. I'll give you an example. So in order to check this, I'm just going to add an onclick event. So what I'm going to do right now is that when I click on this box, it'll change its width and it'll animate it. So let's go change width. Okay, now whenever you have an onclick event like this, you just need to define the function. Now before we define the function, we just need to make sure that it's inside of a script tag inside of the body. So let me just write that function change width. And actually another good thing to do is pass the element itself. So see this div? We're going to actually pass itself into that function that we just wrote. So I'm just going to call it element. And now I will change the width to something else. Now keep in mind that, up until now we were working on properties in CSS. So just changing properties inside a style or changing properties inside of the class, inside head. But there's another way to do it, and it's essentially the same thing. If I just go lm, so this, now I'm in JavaScript. Now we're going to do it through JavaScript. So lm.style, right? And then I have access to all of these properties. Okay, so now I'm just going to change width, and we're going to make it twice as big. Okay, so 200 pixels, and it was 100 pixels. So you'll see that when I click on it, it'll change the width. And by the way, notice that I had to include the px here, or else it wouldn't work. So click on this, and then see how it widens. Let's also make the let me also make the height bigger so you can see that. And also I'll change the background too. Background I'll change to red, and you'll see that it transitions from gray to red inside the animation. And then I'll make the animation even longer, 3 seconds. See, easy enough, right? One thing to note, you can decide which properties to animate and which not to animate. Right now we have it set to all, so anything that I change here will animate. But let's say you just wanted width to animate and everything else to happen right away. So in that case, I would just set it as width here, and then when I click it, it'll just animate the width. Everything else, like the color and the height, happened right away. Now, if you want multiple of these, you could just comma separate them. So I'll have just width and height, but color will not animate, but width and height will. Yeah. Another thing to note is the timing function, or basically how it animates through time. When I click on it, you'll see that it starts fast and it kind of slows down towards the end. That is because by default, the timing function is set to ease. Okay, it's just like even if you don't write anything, it's the same thing as just writing ease here. And if you want to change it, you can see there's a list of different timing functions, but let's say I changed it to linear. You'll see that now the animation happens in a constant way. It doesn't like, speed up or slow down. It just does the whole thing constantly. Another thing I wanted to show you is how do we animate an item's position. So remember how I told you before there's this position absolute, and which gives us basically left, right, top, bottom, and so forth. Let me set the left and the top to 0, and then when I click on this box, we're going to make the left animate. So lm.style.left. So right now it's 0, right? But I'm going to make it, let's say, 300. And then when we click the box, it's going to move to 300. Now, actually, what I'm going to do is get rid of the width and the height just so you can see it a little bit better. Let's get rid of the background as well. Oh, and I had a scale on there. Okay, we'll just give it a margin. So now you can see it. Now, one thing to note is that it's way better to animate transforms and not left, top, and all that stuff, because transforms are generally GPU accelerated, especially on mobile, so it'll be much faster to do so. It's very similar to position absolute, except what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to set a transform. Now a transform, there's a few transforms, but basically translate and scale are the most important ones. And I can translate X to, let's say, 250 pixels, 300, whatever. Like when you have a transform on translate X 0, 0 is essentially the same as not having anything here. So what I'm going to do is that when you click on it, instead of changing left, I'm just going to go transform is equal to translate X 300 pixels. And now it moves as well. Thing is, it's going to move way faster than the left and stuff like that. So it's much better to animate transforms. Just to show you a few other things. In transform, I also have, you know how I showed you translate X? So you can also do translate Y, or you can translate both. Okay. Another thing that you have is something called scale. So let's say I'll make it twice as big or 3 times as big. Now notice that it's scaling it from the origin. So it's going to the middle of the box and it's scaling it from there. So see how like the box was here? So when I make this like 3 times bigger, it's gonna, it scales it from the middle of the box. If I wanted to scale it from the edge of the box, from like location 0, 0, sometimes it works better that way because so like let's say I go like scale 1, scale 2, scale 3, and so forth. So it scales it from this origin point as opposed to the middle. So just know that for the origin anyway. But yeah, I can also animate scales, whatever. So like let's say I'll go lm.style.transform and we'll make it scale 4 times bigger. And we'll start it off from, like I had before, transform origin 0, 0. So now you're going to see it getting a little bit bigger. I just wanted to show you another way on how we can create animations. Transition's probably going to be the one that you use the most and it's the easiest, but sometimes you want to have keyframe animations. So in order to do that, I'm just going to set up an animation. And then I'm going to give it the name of the animation. So let's call it anim1. And then it's going to go for 2 seconds. And it's going to do it infinite times. So thing is, you won't see it doing anything right now because we haven't defined that anim1 yet. So inside the head and inside the style, I'll put that animation in there. And you'll see that what it's doing, so this is our anim1 that I called here, okay? And what you're going to see that it's doing is that in the beginning it sets a state of the transform, and in the end it sets a state for the transform. Doesn't have to be transforms. It could be anything really inside 0%. I mean, any other properties as well. But usually use it for transforms. But in any case, here I just translated it to the origin, to right here, and then I scale it to its default value, which is 1. And over here I scale it to this area, or I mean I translate it to this area, and then I scale it twice as big, and that happens at the end. And I could have had like intermediate steps, like I could have set up 50% here if I wanted it, say, to go like over here or whatever. So another thing is that usually animations don't, you don't really set them up this way. You do it on click. So I have this already written here. So on click, I'm going to call this do anim, and I'll show you how I write it. But basically, just like before where we had this, I'm just going to copy this. I just want to show you the syntax of it. But basically, just like we said it before, lm.style.animation is equal to, and then I'm just going to set it, well, except for the stuff after the colon, that is. So, and also make sure that you don't have a semicolon in here, or else it won't work. So just without a semicolon for the animation, and then just end the statement with the semicolon. But in any case, now when I click on it, it's going to run this do anim, and it's going to set the animation here. So it'll be the same exact thing as before. Another kind of good thing to know about is alternate that you do after the infinite, and it'll make it ping pong between the 0 and the 100. It's almost like it made it go from like 0 to 100, then from 100 to 0, and then it does it again and again. So just a useful thing to know. So one thing I wanted to talk about is, see how like in all these components we have these icons, these glyph icons, like this magnifying glass or this hamburger or this person icon, plus, and so forth. You have them everywhere, like, here. We used to do this with images, but now vectors have become all the rage, and vectors are essentially done with SVG. And I'm going to show you just a quick way on how to, add these glyph icons to your program. So just type in download Bootstrap custom in Google and go to the first link, and we will toggle everything to off, including the second section as well. We're just going to hit glyph icons. Then we're going to go all the way down to the download, compile and download. And it's going to give you bootstrap.zip. Okay, now go to the directory where you downloaded this, and then we're going to unzip it, bootstrap.zip, and then let's just go to CSS, and then bootstrap.css, and we don't need any of this stuff, so just delete it all until you get to font face. One second. Okay, so we got to font face. We're going to keep this, and we're going to keep all the glyph icons themselves. So I'm just going to go all the way to the bottom. Actually, it's quite a lot here. Okay, so I'm going to delete everything after glyph icon, after the glyph icons. So just delete all this stuff at the end of it. Okay, so what we're left with is just the glyph icons and dot glyph icon and font face. Okay, and now we're just going to save the file. Okay, now in order to use these glyph icons, I'm just going to add that style sheet that we just edited into the head section. So link rel is equal to style sheet. href is equal to wherever the directory was that we put the style sheet. And then I just close it like that. And then inside the body, So now that we included it, now we can use them. So inside the body, true to form, we're just going to use a div. Div class is equal to Glyphicon. And notice that I'm using just single quote here. I could have used double quote. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent with them. I generally use single quotes just because it's less things to type than double quote. But yeah. Okay, so now I'm just going to end this, and now you see it. You can make this bigger just by increasing the font size. So I'm just going to go font size is equal to 50 pixels. Whoops. And you can also change things like color and so forth. So I'm just going to add those two. Let me just copy this and paste it a couple times. Glyph icon heart. Okay, it's just one word. And then glyph icon star. And there you go. So I just want to talk about JavaScript really quick. You know, when you start off with JavaScript, you're going to be, a lot of people are going to tell you to use pretty complicated libraries such as this, for example. This is, they're all very complicated if you notice. If you use React or Angular or Redux or any of these things, they're so complicated, you know? Like, let's say I get started, I have to npm install all this stuff. I have to, start dealing with import statements and reducers and stores and subscribes and dispatches and all this stuff just so I can make some kind of time travel debugging possible and undo and redo and state persistence. And it's just not important. Especially for, the things that we create, these apps that we create, I'm talking about like 95% of apps are so basic. They're so basic. They do nothing. They're forms. They're just like these, most apps just don't require this level of sophistication. Even though a lot of people like this kind of stuff just because, I don't know, there's just a lot of features but trust me, all this stuff, it gets in the way. Unless you have like a really important need for something that this helps you solve, then I say you don't need it. But yeah, only use stuff like this if you really see a need. But a lot of people just start off with things like this, and it just makes everything so much heavier. So the more you practice basically creating different components and, just setting up these boxes in different configurations, essentially, you'll be able to create anything you want. They're all the same. They all act exactly the same, especially when you just look at them as a set of boxes, and all these boxes have the same properties that we can change around. In this video, I'm just going to show you how to create a tab control, because this is a good example of how boxy things are. If you just type in HTML5 doctype into Google, just go to the first link and just copy this starter code. And now I'm going to paste it onto our editor. And you can get rid of the body content and the title. So you're just left with this. Now, one thing that I'm going to do, I'm just going to add the glyph icon, Bootstrap CSS that I showed you earlier, just so we can get some icons, just for the sake of demonstration. And let me show you how we can use it. We'll just go like div class glyph icon heart, say, and there you go. Obviously you can make the style, the font size bigger so that you can see it a lot better. Now, whenever you start to code anything, just think of everything as boxes. As I said, I don't like any kind of components or any types in HTML, just divs. The whole thing can just be done with divs. So if you just think about this tab control, it's just, let's say it'll be like a bunch of tabs, right? Like, let's say we'll make 3 tabs or something. And every tab, so think about this as the first tab. And let me just create another div, another box essentially that just has the name of the tab. Now, these two are a part of something that we'll call a tab button. Okay, so I'm just gonna have a class here called tab button. So as you see here, we have this box, and within it we have two other boxes. And yes, the glyph icon is within a box. If I gave it like a background red, you'd see the box. But yes, let's style the tab button right now. Inside the head, I'm just gonna have a style tag. And in here, this is how I target the tab button. And let's just give it, first of all, let's make this font size a little bit smaller. Actually, instead of having its own style, I'm going to give another class here called tab icon, kind of like our own glyph icon. So in tab icon, I'll make the font, let's say 25. Oops. So the tab button itself, let's just give it some, let's just give it a width, a height, and so forth. Let's give it a background. Let's center the text. Let's make the cursor change to a pointer. See, by the way, this is all the stuff that I was talking about in CSS. This is where we actually make it happen. I mean, this is where this all comes into play. I mean, all I'm going to do with JavaScript is essentially just change a little bit of CSS or HTML, but everything is mainly just manipulating CSS and HTML when it comes to programming. I'll show you. But this cursor pointer made it so that when I hover on this, it'll turn into like a little hand. So another thing that I want to do is make this an inline block, because let's say if I had a few tab buttons, let's say if I had two more, I don't want them one after another. Okay, that's what a div does by default because it's block. I want the display to be inline block, not display block, which is the default. So now they're all next to each other. Now let's give it a bit of padding because it's not really nice that it's like right on the edge, So padding 15, we'll give it a lot of space. Let me change the other ones to be something else. So this will be like user and this will be music. And this is obviously tab 2 and tab 3. And see how like close the text is to the icon? We could make it have a little bit of space if we just give it a margin top. So now there's a little bit more space between the text and the icon itself. Another thing to do, especially when you do display inline block, is it gives it a little bit of margin in between the elements. So you can take that off by just going like margin left -5 pixels, and it'll get rid of all the spaces. Now I'm just going to add the actual panels that each button corresponds to. Like when I click this button, one panel will show up, and when I click this one, another panel will show up. So for that, I'll just create, you guessed it, another box. Div class is equal to, say, tab panel. And let me just go, this is tab 1. And then let's create 2 more of these. This is tab 2 and this is tab 3. And now inside the CSS, I'm just going to go tab panel. And let's give it a width. This is just arbitrary, just for demonstration. So a width and a height. Let's give it a background. Remember always the three most important properties are width, height, and background, just to see the actual div. Now notice how all the tabs are showing, right? I don't want all of them to show. Let's just make the first one show, but the other ones to not show. And to do that, I just go display none. Okay, on the ones that I don't want to be shown. And so now we just have, this is tab 1. And what I'm going to be doing is that, you know, when I click on the second one, it's going to show the second one and hide the first one and so forth. Another thing that I'm going to add is the padding on it. And let's make a larger font for it. And that's good for now. Now, one thing that I'll do is I'll make this whole thing into, like, it's always good when you're dealing with just one control or, you know, one component, is to always put it into like one big div. I'm going to call it tab control. So everything's going to be in there. And one thing it'll help me with is to, I'll give it a background so that it's going to basically contain all of this. So when I give it a background, then this won't be white. So tab control. I'm going to give it a background. And let's say we'll give it a width too. And so now it's the color of the tabs. One thing to note, even though the tab control is 500 and the tab panels are also 500, it seems that the tab panels are, it's like bigger. And that is because we have some padding on it. Calculate the padding within the width, like to not have the padding outside of the width, but to include it within the width. In order to do that, I just go box sizing border box, and now it's going to be the same size. Because the padding kind of messed with the width, and again, if I want the padding to be included, the size of it included within the width, just do this line right here. Now, one thing we'll do is we'll make the actual clicking of the tabs, because right now it's only on the first tab. So to do that, I will just add an onclick event onto the buttons. Onclick is equal to tab change, and I'm just going to pass it the parameter 0. See that? And for the other ones, I'm going to do the same thing, except they're going to have a different index. See tab change 0, 1, and 2. And now let's define the tab change. Again, the things that mainly trigger JavaScript are these events. OnClick is a very important one. So inside the script tag is where I'm going to have my JavaScript. This is the only function that we'll need for this. Function tab change, the number. And now what we want to do is we want to set the display to the panel that we clicked on. Right? We have these panels that we defined here, right? Now let's give these panels an ID so that we can, you know, because I give it this ID here, this number, that way I can, you know, because we set the because we set the tab change and the index here, that's how we'll know which panel to turn on and off. Okay, so for that, I'm just going to add an ID of tab panel 0, 1, and so forth. Now, before I turn the panels, every time I basically click on one of these tabs, let's hide all the panels, and then we'll show just the one that I clicked on. So to hide them all, I will go document.querySelector all. We're going to hit tab panel, target tab panel, and then this will return an array. So tab panels, say. And then in order to iterate on an array, it's pretty easy to use the for each command. So this will run this function on every one that's inside this array. So say it's going to give me this panel. And for each panel, I'm just style.display is equal to none. So this will hide all the panels whenever I click on one of these. See, it hid them all now. But we're just going to make the one that we clicked on show. So for that, document.querySelector tab panel plus the number, the parameter that we sent to this function. .style.display is equal to block. So this will just show the specific panel that we clicked on. Its associated button, that is. So see how, like, when I click it now, it shows 3, 2, and 1. So it's changing these panels correctly. Now let's make it so that when I click on one of these buttons, it will select the button, or it'll show that the color changed. For that, I am just going to add a class called selected. Let's give it a background of 999. Hexes can be either like 3 digits or 6 digits. If they're 3 digits, it just kind of looks at this just like 9999. So now inside the tab change function, I'll just go document.querySelector. And by the way, when I another thing that I should do is add a ID to each one of these. So ID is equal to tab button, whatever that button index is, just like the panels. So tab button 1, tab button 2, and so forth. And so now I could just change it here. I mean, I can target it here. So tab button num .class list .add selected. So this will add the selected class to it when I click on it. So you'll see that when it's clicked on, it'll add it. But we want to make sure that the other ones are hidden before we do, just like we did with the panels, where we turn them all off. So let me just go document.querySelector all tab button. Okay, so for each tab button, I'm just going to go button.classList.remove selected. And this will remove the selected class from all the buttons. So now when I click on it, it'll just click the right tab. And that's it. I mean, inside these tabs, you could have, you know, whatever. It could be as, you know, could have any kind of content that you want. One other thing that I forgot to do is it's always good, especially when you're dealing with a component. Like right now, our main component is called tab control, right? So one thing I like to do is have this first one, the tab control. So it's basically this. And then all the ones that have to do with tab control, just put this thing before them. So it knows to only target things within tab control. Meaning, like, see this tab button? If it was out here, class is equal to tab button, it won't even target it. It won't style it. See how it's not styling it? It'll only style it if it's inside of the tab control. Like if it's in here. That's what that's what this thing means. Basically, it has to be inside of tab control for it to be affected. Now, one thing to note is, let's say I wanted 2 of these controls on my page at the same time. So I mean, it'd be pretty easy enough. I just go and I copy the HTML to both of them. Now, one thing is that you'll notice that when I click on one of the tabs, it'll screw up the other one, and we don't want that. What we want will be to, so instead of, when we did the tab change, we did document.querySelectAll, right? Document.querySelector. That means that it starts from the beginning of the entire document, and it goes through everything that matches it, including both this tab control and this tab control. So what we can do instead is in the tab change event, I'm going to give it the actual tab button. And all that means is that I just need to pass in this. Okay, whenever you pass in this inside of an onclick, it'll just give the div that you're currently on. So let's pass this one in as well, and this one in. Okay, and the same thing for these other ones. Now that I have the button inside of here, I can get the control itself. Let's go var tab control is equal to tab button dot parent node, which will basically, so if this is the tab button that we passed in, if I go to the parent node, I'll have the tab control, right? And then instead of going document dot on everything here, I'm going to go tab control. Okay, instead of document. So it'll start its search from the current tab control that it's on. So when it does the query selectors, it'll only go to the specific tab control that we're on. So it won't affect the other ones. See, so now they're separate. But sometimes it's worthwhile to create a component, and by that I mean, you'll notice that right now I just have a function for everything, and functions are actually pretty powerful, and most of the components that I showed you before in the material UI stuff can be functions. They're very simple, but sometimes you need to create a component. And to understand why, like for example, let's say I wanted to share this tab control, just like one of these things between like multiple applications. I mean, sometimes you might have like dozens of applications that use the same tab. So for that, it would be better to create a tab control, not just have it as just one little function like this. So let me just show you how to create a component really quick. It's very simple because I don't really, the thing is, you'll notice that in frameworks, when they tell you that they're going to create a component, they usually mean replacing the, creating a custom component instead of these divs, which is what I definitely don't want to do. I want to always keep it just divs on everything because I'm typeless. So the only thing that I want to do is create an object for these tabs that will do a lot of the work here for us. And I'll show you that next. Now, before I show you how to create a component, I just want to show you one quick thing in JavaScript that's super important to know. But basically, you know how I told you that we have an object, right? And this I explained in my video about data boxes, how data could be a hierarchy of primitives, arrays, and objects, and so forth. We also have a function, right, that gets called like on an event. My function one, say. Now, one thing to understand, one thing that's super important to know is that there's also another type of function, which would be a function that we notate by capitalizing the first letter. So my function, say, right? Just because we capitalize this first letter, we know that it's not going to act like a regular function. It's just going to act as a namespace. What that means is that I'm going to use it as its own object. Okay, have you ever seen this where you go new on, say, like my function? This this line, we'll just convert it into an object. Okay, and the the variables and functions that this thing might have is inside of this. So this dot num is equal to 1, right? This dot my inner func is equal to function, and so on. Excuse me. Inside of a namespace, we always have either variables or functions. Okay, so when I made this dot num is equal to 1 and this dot my inner function is equal to this function, now when I instantiated it here, this object right here will have these properties. Let's go console.log on obj and I'll show you. So when we console.log this object, and don't worry about all this crazy errors, it's just because I'm inside of an iframe, and every time I change a character, it tries to eval this whole thing. But so like if I just write some text, it'll freak out until the code is actually until it's correct as far as how it parses. But anyway, but console.log obj, this is what I outputted, and see how it has its own my inner function and its variable num is equal to 1. So just note that we have regular functions that we call, right? That maybe like they get called on an event. Maybe I had like, this is like an init function that gets called on body on load, right? These are regular functions that get called like either on like a onclick event or onload event or whatever, right? And these are probably the most popular, right? This and the objects. As far as JavaScript is concerned, I mean, you have objects, you have functions, and you have, control flow statements like ifs and fors and all that stuff. And then you have, this is just a way to create a namespace. Okay. A namespace is just something that has either functions or variables. I could have done the same exact thing as this. See right here? Like when I did new my function, let me make this smaller so it doesn't wrap. But I could have had the same exact thing. I could have said like function create my function, say, right? And this would have made an object. Obj.num is equal to num. Obj.my inner func is equal to function. And then I return obj. So let me actually put it over here. So this thing right here is completely equivalent to create my function. Okay, this and this are the same. Where I create an object and I return an object and I set some properties on the object, like a primitive and a function. Same thing with this. So whenever you see this new keyword that I use, and I just like this first one better because I don't know, I'm just used to it from my object-oriented programming days where I just created an object from a class. So it works kind of in a similar way. So I just prefer this first syntax. But just note that they're exactly the same. They're essentially both just creating an object. Okay, so when I instantiate this with new, I just created a new object, just like this one. So when I create components, you'll see that I make use of this a lot. So I just wanted to show you the component version of what we just did. Like if I want to create, and when I say component, I just mean, an object, a namespace. And a namespace just means like variables and functions together in some object. Okay. Before we just had something called change tab, and it was a global function. But sometimes it's a little bit cleaner to put, let's say, a function inside of a given namespace. Like, so when I instantiate tab control, when I create new tab control, it's going to create an object, okay, and it's going to put it inside this variable. Right now, because there's 3 tab controls, see 1, 2, 3, it's going to create 3 of these objects. Let me just show you what it looks like. See how I just typed in UI there, and these are the 3 objects that I have. So each object has its own change tab. And this is kind of clean because you can go like, UI dot tab 3 dot change tab, and let's change it to the 4th because it's 0 base. So 0, 1, 2, 3 to the 4th tab, and we'll change it to this one. See, I'll change it back to the 0 so you'll see again. But it's just nice to have basically like objects, especially if you have like a lot of them. Another thing that tab controls, like when I make it into its own component like this, I can initialize it in a certain way. So for example, if you look at my at this code, you'll notice that the actual tabs, there's less stuff in them right now. And that's because I'm auto-generating the buttons in this component, and that's what this code does right here. It'll create it'll go through each one of the panels, right? Let's say I went through this panel, and it'll create a heart button, and then it'll create a user button based on this data-icon. That's what this tab panel.dataset.icon is equal to. So regardless, I mean, you don't have to know all the details here, but just note that the only difference between this and what we had before is that now I'm creating an object for each one of these tab controls, and each one of those objects has its own set of functions and its own internal variables, and that can help, especially when you're like I could have essentially taken this tab control, right, just taken this and put it in its own file called, let's say, tabcontrol.js, and maybe I take this and I'd put it in tabcontrol.css, and then I could use it in a different program. It's just a bit cleaner that way. So I'm gonna have the source code to this so you could just look it over, but this is about as complex as things get as far as my code is concerned. I mean, it's essentially just what JavaScript is doing. We're just changing around CSS properties, right? And maybe we're adding or appending or removing HTML, kind of like we're doing here, where here we're adding HTML. So JavaScript, think of JavaScript as just a way to manipulate CSS and HTML. That's why so much of this video was just based on CSS, because these are the main properties that we're always going to change for everything, because again, everything is just a box. When I create a component, even though it's an object, right, I definitely don't want a new type here. That's what a lot of my videos are all about, is that I prefer to just have divs for everything, just containers, just like the way var is just a container in code. So again, the main thing that you'll find from the way I code is that I don't like to create new types. Okay, so when I'm creating components, they're just objects in code, but they don't really change they might change the HTML by injecting more divs into the HTML, but I'm not creating new types or anything like that. It's always just going to be hierarchies of divs. I basically want the UI to remain typeless, but with the use of JavaScript, all I'm doing is just, either manipulating CSS or manipulating HTML in some way, like maybe adding more divs or whatever with my components that I create. A lot of this stuff as we code, and this will be the last video of this series, because I'm just going to show you a lot of, my next videos are going to be more about like just showing specific examples of just how to create stuff, because it's all the same, all of this stuff. Whenever you create a program, just think about it as boxes and manipulating boxes, and that's it, really. Don't make it more complicated than that. I'll show you a lot of examples in future videos, but you're going to see that they're all essentially the same. It's all what I showed you in this video, which is basically just manipulating CSS and HTML through code. That's what JavaScript is, but that's about it. Just see everything as a box, and you'll see how we can create everything.